It's 6 a.m. You're standing at the mirror, and you say it out loud. I am a magnet for success. But something in your chest sinks, like your stomach just heard a lie. The feeling gets worse. The brain doesn't automatically believe the nicest sentence in the room. That sinking feeling is neural hardware doing exactly what it was built to do. The same circuit that fires when you tell a deliberate lie. In the next 15 minutes, I'll show you 3 things. What your brain literally does when you say an affirmation. Why the people who need it most are the exact ones being hurt by it. And there's a researcher in Texas who spent more than 40 years uncovering something darker. We'll get to him.
You're watching Brain Shift.
You've felt this before. Maybe not in front of a mirror. Maybe it was when someone you love looked at you and said, "You're amazing." And instead of warmth, your stomach dropped. You smiled, said thank you, and felt like a fraud. Or it was the motivational quote on the office wall, the wellness app pushing you a daily mantra, the morning huddle where the team chants, "We are unstoppable," and you mouth the words and feel emptier walking out than you did walking in. Yeah, that one. If positive thinking ever made you feel slightly worse instead of better, you're not broken. You're not ungrateful. You're not negative. You're running a 200,000-year-old fraud detection system that was never designed to be turned off by a sentence written on a Post-it note. And there's a name for what just happened to you. A team of researchers gave it one in 2009. What they found made the entire self-help industry quietly uncomfortable. Here's where it gets interesting. At the University of Waterloo, a team led by a psychologist named Joanne Wood ran an experiment that sounds harmless on paper. They took a group of college students, sorted them by self-esteem, and for 4 minutes, every 15 seconds, when the students heard a bell, they had to repeat one sentence to themselves. I am a lovable person. 16 reps. The exact phrase the wellness industry has been selling for 40 years. Then they measured everyone's mood. Before I tell you what happened, pause for a second. Predicted. If you had to guess which group felt better afterward, who would you pick? The people who already believed they were lovable, or the people who didn't? The people who started with high self-esteem felt slightly better. A small bump, nothing dramatic. But the people who started with low self-esteem, the ones who actually needed the sentence to land, felt measurably worse. Mood didn't stay flat. It dropped about 34% compared to controls. State self-esteem dropped too. Same sentence, opposite outcomes, depending entirely on who was saying it. And here's the uncomfortable part. You probably already know which group you'd be in. The people the affirmation industry was built for, the ones standing in front of mirrors at 6 a.m. trying to fix something, were the ones being hurt by it. But the number isn't the part that matters. The number is just the symptom. What matters is what's happening underneath. Because there's an exact moment your brain flips that sentence from being neutral to being toxic. And to see it, I have to show you a piece of brain behind your forehead. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Behind your forehead, there's a piece of brain called the medial prefrontal cortex, the MPFC. Don't worry about the name. Picture this. Your brain keeps a running file on you. Who you are, what you're good at, what you're terrible at, how lovable you are, how safe you are, how likely you are to be rejected at a party. Every memory, every story, every verdict your life has ever handed you about who you are, it all lives in this file. Neuroscientists call it the self model, your operating system, the DNA signature of your identity. The MPFC keeps this file open all the time, even when you're not thinking about yourself, even when you sleep. So when you stand in front of the mirror and say, I am a lovable person, that sentence doesn't just float into your head. It walks straight into the MPFC, knocks on the door, and asks the file one question. Does this match what's in here? For the person with low self-esteem, the file says no. And in the next half second, something happens that turns the affirmation from a sentence into a wound. Because the MPFC isn't alone in there. It has a partner. And that partner is about to ruin the whole party. Sitting right next to the MPFC is another piece of brain called the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC. The ACC has one job. It watches for mismatches. It's the part of your brain that fires when you say one thing and mean another. When you read the word red written in blue ink and your brain stutters. When you make a typo and feel that flash of, oh, wrong, before you even consciously notice. It's the airport security scanner of your skull. And remember the hardware I mentioned at the start? The same hardware that fires when you tell a deliberate lie? This is it. The ACC isn't a mood center. It's a fraud detector. It's been doing this job for a very long time. Long before motivational posters. Long before journals. Long before language. Because in the world we evolved in, telling yourself you were strong when you were actually weak, that wasn't optimism. That was a way to get eaten. So when I am a lovable person walks into your skull, the MPFC opens the file. The file says, no, look at all this evidence to the contrary. And the ACC stands up like a prosecutor. It cross-examines the claim. It pulls up the rejection from the 8th grade, the relationship that ended badly, the text that didn't get answered, the moment you walked into the room and nobody looked up. It throws every piece of counter-evidence at the witness stand. And here's what's genuinely strange. You don't see this happen. It happens underneath awareness, in milliseconds. All you feel is the sinking, the stomach drop. Neuroscientists call it aversive arousal, same circuitry that fires during pain, during cognitive dissonance, during a lie. You weren't supposed to feel comforted. You were supposed to be cross-examined. And if some part of you is doubting any of this right now, that doubt, that's the ACC, right now, while you're watching. Same circuit, different sentence. Now here's the dark part. The ACC fires harder when the claim is bigger, which means the people who repeat affirmations the most aggressively, the ones who scream, I am enough, into the mirror, the ones who write it 100 times in a journal, the ones who paid for the course, those people aren't getting more healing. They're getting more cross-examination. So here's another way to see it. Imagine you're handed a $100 bill that you suspect is counterfeit. You don't feel richer. You check the watermark, you hold it up to the light, you squint at the threads. The very act of receiving it makes you investigate it. That's your brain with an unbelievable affirmation. It doesn't accept the gift. It checks the watermark. And in checking, it finds every reason the bill is fake. Every memory of being unlovable becomes more vivid, not less. The affirmation doesn't paint over the wound, it puts a spotlight on it. Psychologists call this the latitude of acceptance. Land close to what someone already believes, the brain accepts it. Land too far away, the brain doesn't just reject it, it actively pushes the other direction. Harder push, harder snapback. Like a coiled spring you press down on. The harder you press, the more violently it pops when you let go. That's why telling someone with low self-esteem, you are lovable, can feel like pouring salt on a cut and saying, see, it doesn't hurt. Contact with the painful spot makes it worse. Praise doesn't soothe the wound, it illuminates it. Now, at this point, you might think the case is closed. Brain rejects affirmations, affirmations bad, move on. Except there's a problem with this story, a big one, and it leads directly to that researcher in Texas I mentioned at the start, the one who spent more than 40 years on something darker. We're almost there. But first, every honest neuroscientist will stop you right here before they let you walk out of the room. Not every researcher agrees on this. In 2020, another team of psychologists tried to replicate the Wood study. Same experiment, same sentence, same instructions. And they did not find the same backfire effect. So if I'm being honest with you, the headline, "Affirmations always hurt low self-esteem people," that's not what the evidence proves. The specific 34% drop is contested, but the neuroscience underneath it is not. The MPFC running a self-file, the ACC scanning for mismatch, the brain defending the coherence of its own operating system. That part shows up in fMRI studies of cognitive dissonance. In EEG recordings, low self-esteem brains literally produced an avoidance signal when they heard positive statements about themselves. And the entire literature on something called self-verification.
What we can honestly say is this: generic, global, unbelievable self-praise is psychologically unstable. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it does nothing, and sometimes, for the people who most need it, it lights up the wrong circuit. And this is where the story should end. Except it doesn't. Because there's a layer underneath this one that the replication debate doesn't touch. A finding that, when I first read it, made me put the article down and walk around the room. Someone has been studying not why the brain rejects positive feedback, but why the brain fights to keep believing the negative. This is the researcher in Texas I mentioned at the start. His name is William Swan. He's been at the University of Texas for more than 40 years. And the thing he discovered is genuinely difficult to sit with. People will fight to keep believing the worst things about themselves. Read that sentence again, because the rest of this video depends on whether you actually let it in. In his studies, people who saw themselves as unlovable actively preferred to spend time with people who confirmed that view. Given a choice between someone who saw them positively and someone who saw them negatively, they chose negative. Not because they enjoyed it, because it felt true. And true felt safer than nice. Yeah. Swan calls this self-verification. Your brain wants its self-file to be accurate more than it wants the self-file to be kind. Because accurate lets you predict the world. Accurate lets you know how to act. Accurate gives you coherence. And the brain will defend that coherence the way an immune system defends the body, even when what's being defended is a wound. So when the affirmation walks in and says, "You are lovable," it's not just being rejected, it's being attacked. The brain treats it like an organ transplant from the wrong donor. The psychological immune system inflames. The whole system reacts. Right. This is why it doesn't just fail. This is why it hurts. Which raises the obvious question. If your brain will actively defend a wound, if it would rather be painfully consistent than briefly comforted, then how does anyone ever change? How does anyone ever update the self-model? Because people do change. So what makes that happen? In 2010, a team at the University of Illinois ran a study that, on paper, sounds boring. Anagrams. They gave students word puzzles. Before the task, half the students wrote, "I will" 20 times. The other half wrote, "Will I" 20 times. 2 letters, a question mark. That was the entire difference. The Will I group solved 41% more anagrams. Wait, 41%? From moving 2 words around? I had to check that twice. Then the team tested it again. Different setups, different tasks, intentions to exercise, intrinsic motivation. The advantage held up every time. Here's why. A declarative, "I will succeed," walks into the MPFC and demands the file accept a conclusion. The ACC stands up. Same courtroom, same prosecutor. But a question, "Will I succeed?" doesn't make a claim. It opens a search. It walks past the prosecutor entirely. Instead of forcing the file to swallow a verdict, it invites the brain to go looking for evidence, for strategies, for reasons. A statement asks the brain to believe. A question asks the brain to search. And that one shift, That's the entire crack in the wall. Once researchers found that crack, others started looking for more. At the University of Michigan, another team found something even smaller. Just switching from I to your own name when you talk to yourself. So instead of, why am I feeling this way? It becomes, why is Sarah feeling this way? If your name happens to be Sarah. Referring to yourself by name, like you're watching someone else work through it, the brain doesn't get hit as hard. Same trick. The prosecutor doesn't recognize you from the gallery.
Then there's a completely different angle, a whole separate tradition called values-based self-affirmation. This one doesn't ask you to claim a trait. It asks you to reflect on something you already believe in: honesty, family, curiosity. Brain scans show this activates the reward system. The ventral striatum lights up. Same circuit that responds to good food and music. Because you're not asking the brain to swallow a lie. You're reminding it of a truth it already holds. And then there's the gentlest one, a practice called self-compassion. The simple act of speaking to yourself in moments of pain the way you'd speak to a friend in pain. Not, I am amazing. Just, this is hard. Other people have struggled with this too. I can be on my own side for a minute. None of these techniques ask the brain to believe something it doesn't. They ask it to search, to remember, to soften. They go around the prosecutor instead of through it. Which leaves one last question. If your brain is this protective of who it currently believes you are, what does that actually mean about who you are?
Here's where I think we land. The reason affirmations didn't work for you isn't that you didn't believe hard enough, isn't that you didn't repeat them enough, isn't a failure of optimism or vibe. It's that your brain has a system specifically designed to keep your inner story coherent. And that system doesn't take orders from a Post-it note. It updates from evidence, from action, from the slow accumulation of moments where you actually showed up for yourself and watched it happen. Confidence is not installed by repetition. It is updated by evidence. And here's what I find genuinely strange about that. The same fraud detector that refused to let you believe you were lovable when you didn't feel it, that same system, the moment the evidence shifts, will defend the new story just as fiercely. The ACC doesn't care whether the self-model is dark or kind. It cares whether it's accurate, which means the moment it flips, it becomes just as protective of the new version. This isn't a flaw. This is what makes change permanent when it happens. Think about every person who has ever gone from genuinely believing they weren't enough to knowing they were. They didn't get there by winning an argument with their brain. They got there by giving the file new evidence, by surviving things they thought they couldn't, by showing up enough times that the prosecutor stopped objecting. The file updated. The system defended the new story, and it held. Your brain was never working against you. It was working for accuracy. And accuracy, it turns out, is the only architecture that makes change stick. So that mirror at 6 a.m, it wasn't your enemy. It was the fraud detector doing exactly its job. And now you know what that job actually is. That's your brain shift. Now you know.